think it's fine to continue to talk, but I think the most important talk we have is with our allies and making sure that Russia understands that if they take action to overthrow the government in Ukraine or to invade Ukraine, that there will be consequences of a severe nature. We didn't do that as effectively as we should have after the invasion by Russia of Georgia, after their prior invasion taking Crimea. They've got to understand that there will be extraordinary consequence.
Welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Ignatius, a columnist for the Post. We have a special guest today, Senator Mitt Romney, senator from Utah, GOP presidential candidate in 2012, and now ranking Republican member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Romney, thank you so much for joining Washington Post Live.
Thank you very much, David. Happy to join you. I wish I were the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but I'm happy to be on the committee.
Well, we're happy to give you the battlefield promotion, and we'll wait for the future. We have a lot to discuss this morning, from Ukraine to China, but I want to begin with the surprise announcement this morning that U.S. Special Operations Forces had killed overnight the leader of ISIS, Abu Ibrahim al-Qurayshi. I'd be interested in hearing your reaction to President Biden's decision to authorize that strike.
Well, I think it was the right thing to do. There's no question but that ISIS continues to pose a threat to our friends and allies, not only in the Middle East, but in other parts of the world. That the battle against extremism and jihadism is one that's not finished. It will go on as long as they continue to attack and to maim and kill. And so removing their commander, the head of ISIS, is obviously a huge accomplishment, is to be congratulated. And of course, we look at the members of our military that carried out this strike, and you have to acknowledge their extraordinary bravery and their skill.
Senator, let's turn to Ukraine. Members of Congress are said to have had a briefing today from administration officials about the situation. Tell us what you can about the current status of the military threat, about the status of diplomatic efforts to avert an invasion. What did you hear today that you can share with our listeners?
Well, first of all, the Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs described the intelligence that we have with regards to the region, and I would just note that the peril has not been overstated. That the risk to Ukraine, to its leadership, and to the people there is real, and that we're right to be focused on it. I can't be more specific than that. I should not be more specific than that. At the same time, I think it's important that we recognize that the only way we're going to deter Russia from its attempt to try and rebuild, if you will, parts of the old Soviet Union in terms of a sphere of influence, is to let them know that we, as not just the United States of America, but we as NATO and our friends and allies around the world, will continue to insist that Russia and China abide by the rules-based international order. And part of that is you don't invade sovereign nations. You let individuals choose their own course in their nations. And what Russia is attempting to do in Ukraine is unacceptable. And we will carry out various sanctions and punishments if they violate the rules that have been guiding the world for the last 75 years.
Senator, based on what you heard today and what you know from following the situation closely, do you believe that President Putin is likely to invade Ukraine?
I think he has every opportunity and is fully prepared to invade. I've never tried to get inside the mind of Vladimir Putin, so I don't know what his intentions are, but there are a number of things that are possibilities. One is that he intends to invade. Another is that he wanted to test NATO and see whether we're able to be pulled apart. What he found instead is that we are able to come together. NATO is stronger, I think, by virtue of his threats. And that's a good thing, because we need our allies and friends, not only as we confront Russia in Europe, but also as we consider China and their expansive interests around the world. So he failed on that front, and then I think you have to ask whether he's going to take military action there or some other type of action. I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you that based upon the briefings we've had, that the very real threat is not overstated, and that we should be prepared in the event that there is an invasion.
Let me ask you to assess President Biden's handling of this crisis. President's latest move with NATO allies was to order a forward deployment of 3,000 American troops, some from Germany, some coming from the U.S., to frontline NATO countries. That's the latest in a series of what have been fairly tough-minded responses. How would you assess his performance?
Well, the first part of his performance is to engage on a diplomatic front and to sit down and talk with Putin or his emissaries and to understand what they say they want. I have to acknowledge that the only time Putin is lying is if his lips are moving. So you have to take whatever is being said at these diplomatic meetings with a very large grain of salt. Nonetheless, Secretary Blinken and other members of the administration have done a dutiful job negotiating with the Russians, but also a heroic job linking with our allies and making sure that Russia understands it's not just the U.S., but it's all of us that have come together. And then on the military front, I think it's important to point out we're not going to go to war with Russia. We're not going to enter into a battle. I mean, sending over 3,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 troops is not going to be in any way sufficient to go into war with a superpower or a major power, Russia, on their continent. That's not going to happen. But sending those troops, as the president has done, sends a message to our allies. It says to our allies, we care. We are there for you. We are there for NATO. This is important to us. That's what it does. It also sends a message to Russia that we are united as NATO and that we will stand with our NATO allies. We will stand by the commitments we've made to NATO. So that's what's being done, and I think it's the right step on the president's part. Whether those troops should be supplemented or not, those are questions which General Milley and Secretary Austin will have to resolve, but the message is being sent, and that's appropriate.
And I hear you giving the Biden team pretty high marks for working with NATO, working with our allies to make sure that we have a unified response. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, you do get that right. And there's a perception, I think, that a lot of us have that are a little older, that somehow what America wants, we ought to be able just to ask for and everybody will fall in line. But the world is different than it was in the 1960s. In 1960, the U.S. was responsible for 40% of the economy of the entire world. 40%. Today, it's 24%. And for us to have the capacity to, if you will, get nations like Russia and China to abide by the rules of the international order, we really do need to link arms with other economies in the world. And whether those are economies in the East or whether they're economies in Europe or Latin America, it is important for us to have a collaborative response. And so whether you're concerned about Russia or concerned about China or any other malevolent actor, it's important for us to be aligned with our friends because that gives us more clout and makes it more likely that people will take what we have to say more seriously.
So, Senator, you've been warning about the threat from Russia for a long time. Back in the 2012 presidential campaign, you took some flack from President Obama during one of the debates because you described Russia as our number one geopolitical foe. Obama claimed that was 1980s thinking, putting you down. But I have to say, it looks pretty solid in retrospect. I want to ask you whether you think that politicians from both parties have taken their eye off the Russian threat, and ask in particular about people in the Republican Party, especially former President Trump, who have sometimes seemed to be minimizing the Russian threat.
Yeah, I think it's very possible to minimize the threat because things have been going along pretty well for the last few decades, with the exception of Russia's invasion of Georgia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine to take Crimea. So they've shown who they are. and recognize the incentives here, which is Russia has a population about 1/10 the size of China. Russia wants to be a superpower. It wants to be in the room where it happens, if you will, and so it wants more population. It wants more economic base. Look, we don't buy anything from Russia other than energy. No one does. And their industrial base is just not competitive. So they're looking for a stronger industrial base, a stronger population base. And so they're looking at the old Soviet empire, and they want to rebuild part of the Soviet Union, perhaps not with the same title on it, but with the same economic and military potential. So that's just the reality. John McCain used to say that Russia was a gas station parading as a country. They want to change that. And so you can expect Vladimir Putin to continue to take aggressive action, one, to strengthen his hand, and number two, to weaken ours. And so what I said back in 2012 was based on those things, which is Russia will continue to poke us in the eye to support anything or anyone who opposes our interests, to throw sand in the gears of the international order. Everything they can do to try and weaken us and strengthen them is something they're going to do. Will we be at war with Russia? No. They don't want to be at war any more than we do. And we're a heck of a lot stronger anyway. But they are going to do what they think they need to do to try and strengthen their hand. And we have to say to them, look, if you do that on a legitimate basis and try and win the hearts and minds of people, that's fine. But if you invade others, or you use illegal means to change leadership in other nations, why, that's something which is going to be an open door to other malevolent actors, and that's simply not acceptable. And those things inevitably lead to global conflict, as they have in our past.
Senator, do you think that that other Republicans, most Republicans in Congress, will end up supporting you, a position that you just outlined, and President Biden, who has a similar view on this crisis, and that we'll have some political unity behind what the U.S. does? What's your judgment about that?
I do believe that Senator Risch, who is the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, and Senator Menendez, a Democrat on that committee, will come together with a piece of legislation which talks about the sanctions that will be applied on Russia. I think there is broad support for standing with our friends and showing full commitment to the rules-based international order. I think that's real. At the same time, there will inevitably be some people who, if you will, carry out the performance politics that we've seen from time to time, and try and win some political points. And they may very well believe those points entirely from their own conscience, which is their right to do. But so we're not going to have 100% unity by any means. But I believe that the great majority of Republicans in the Senate, at least, will be convinced that we should be committed to NATO, that we should be committed to our involvement in the world. I mean, I hope people understand that the reason we're involved in the world, the reason we have troops all over the world, the reason that we are engaged around the world is in our own interest. We don't just do this because we care about everybody in the world, though we do. We care about America. And, I used to laugh at the phrase America first. It's been America first for the last 75 years. We've been involved in the world, investing in the world to try and keep the world peaceful and to make it a place where we're able to sell goods and services so that our people can do well financially. So that's been the reason we've been involved in the world, and it continues to be a reason for that involvement.
One more question about Ukraine before we turn to other subjects. I'm curious, Senator, whether you would support some of the diplomatic proposals that have leaked in the last few days that are attempts by the United States to see if there is some way to de-escalate this crisis. Two in particular involve mutual inspection of missile facilities on both sides. The Russians could look at missiles in Ukraine with some reciprocity. Another is a U.S. guarantee that American troops wouldn't be stationed in Ukraine, regardless of the NATO membership issue. Similarly, that Russian troops wouldn't be in Ukraine either. Would you support measures like that as part of a diplomatic package?
I think it's appropriate to consider measures which we feel are in our interest. and in the interest of global peace and in the interest of the security of Ukraine and other nations in the region. But at the same time, I think it's very important that we don't agree to changes or conditions as a result of being pressured by Russia putting 100,000 troops on the border of a nation. So this is not a time for us to agree to things that we wouldn't otherwise have agreed to. So I think it's. I mean, we have the old statement, which is you don't negotiate with terrorists, and I'm not calling Russia a terrorist necessarily, but I do say that when you have 100,000 troops on the border and ships amassing in the Black Sea, and you're giving every indication of the readiness for an invasion, you don't sit down with those people and say, hey, what would you like? That's the wrong approach. It'll just be met with that happening time and time again.
So I want to make sure I'm clear on this. Are you saying that we shouldn't be offering diplomatic proposals, written responses to Russian proposals until Russian troops are removed from their current positions near the border?
Well, there's been report, for instance, that Russia is insisting that we commit that Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. Well, that's not something we're going to do. That they're, if you will, showing military might to try and exact a commitment of that nature, which is simply unacceptable to America, violates our principles. No, we won't do that. Are there other things that we might agree to that we would otherwise have agreed to, and that are in mutual interest, such as we get to inspect yours and you get to inspect ours? Hey, that's fair game. But so those discussions are appropriate and are ongoing. But acceding to demands as a result of Russia's military buildup is not the right course to take, and I doubt the administration will go in that path anyway.
So let's turn to several other issues, starting with China. You've been a strong critic, warning about growing Chinese military power. I ask whether you worry that with so much focus on Ukraine, we may be in danger of losing focus on what many people think is a bigger long-term strategic threat to the United States coming from China. What's your sense about that?
Well, China is a much greater threat to the global order and to the United States than is Russia. That doesn't mean we can't pay attention to more than one thing at a time. And we are, after all, a great nation with a lot of very good people. And China represents a real challenge as a result of a number of things. One is its economy is going to be much larger than ours at some point, and their military will therefore be much larger than ours. We haven't encountered anything like that, at least in the last 75 years, because when we were battling the Soviet Union in a Cold War, they were economically a backwater. But China is going to be a very powerful nation economically, technologically, and militarily. China has also laid out a very clear game plan as to what they want to accomplish over the next 50 years. And we ought to read it and be convinced that they intend to do what they say they intend to do, which is to become the world leader, militarily, economically, and geopolitically. And they also are threatening a very key group of people who in Taiwan. So we have to recognize that China long term is a much greater threat to the global order, even than the geopolitical machinations of Vladimir Putin.
So you mentioned Taiwan, which is the obvious flashpoint between us and China. Last Thursday, China's new ambassador to the United States warned that the U.S. could face a military conflict, in his words, with China over Taiwan. There's a long-standing argument about whether the United States should be explicit about its willingness to defend Taiwan if attacked. President Biden recently, after some contradictory language, reaffirmed the U.S. policy of what is called strategic ambiguity, not saying exactly what we would do. What's your judgment about whether we ought to be explicit about our willingness to defend Taiwan?
I think ambiguity is the right course with regards to our military commitment. At the same time, I think it's very important for China to recognize that our economic response and that of our allies and friends around the world would be withering if China were to invade or otherwise take over the island of Taiwan and the people there. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's important for us to be clear in our response to what Russia's doing in Ukraine, because obviously China's watching as well. So people who say, "Hey, why do we care about Ukraine? Let's just forget Ukraine." It's like, guys, recognize we care about not just Ukraine, but Taiwan and other places in the world, Hong Kong and so forth. And showing resolve is critical in each of these places. So be very, very clear about the economic implications that we and others would impose on China were there to be malevolent activity by China against Taiwan. But on a military front, that's something I think you keep in our back pocket and have the Chinese uncertain as to exactly what we would do.
So, last question about China. The Winter Olympic Games begin in a matter of hours. You have urged other countries to support a diplomatic boycott, but not an athlete's boycott of the games. I'm curious what you think about athletes speaking out about political issues while they're in Beijing. Chinese officials have given stern warnings against any such political comments. What do you think? Is that something that's appropriate for athletes at an Olympics or not?
Well, the International Olympic Committee should have never awarded the games to Beijing. Now, in the defense of the IOC, Beijing has put in place a number of even more awful actions since the games were awarded there. But the laws in China, which prohibit any criticism of the CCP, of the Communist Chinese Party, make it unacceptable for athletes to be in that setting. But we are where we are. These athletes have trained their entire lives to be able to be in Olympic Games, and so they are there. But for their own personal safety, they're going to have to make sure they abide by Chinese law. And it's outrageous that they're put in that position. But there are ways that they can make their feelings known. I know I've read a number of articles and spoken with individuals about the kinds of actions being considered by athletes. They have to obviously make sure they're following Chinese law. But look, we can't have the International Olympic Committee awarding games to authoritarian states that use the Olympics as a platform for propaganda and which threaten the free speech rights of our athletes. That simply can't happen again.
So I want to turn to several political issues before we have to end our discussion, starting with the question of the Senate's vote on confirming a nominee, when that nominee is selected to replace Justice Breyer. President Biden has said he intends to nominate a black woman for that seat. He's gotten some criticism from Republicans for that. What's your judgment about making explicit that commitment? Does it trouble you?
I don't have a problem with that. There are 54 black women who are federal judges. Surely among those 54, there must be more than one that would be qualified to be on the Supreme Court. I know we want the best and brightest, but there are a lot of best and brightest across our entire country. And I think it would be a positive thing to have an African-American woman on the Supreme Court, helping represent the diversity of our nation. And I hope he's able to find a person that I can end up supporting.
Let's talk finally about where our country is these days. You were among the first Republicans to congratulate Joe Biden on his election victory. You made a statement on November 7. Some polls show that a majority of Republicans still, more than a year later, don't accept that Joe Biden won the election fairly. And I wonder what you say to them as a fellow Republican. and whether you worry about a party in which so many people are denying what you viewed as a fact so soon after the election. What do you say to your fellow Republicans?
Well, I scratch my head a bit, to tell you the truth, David, because the argument that somehow Joe Biden didn't win is not bolstered by any facts. It's been a year almost, well, more than a year. There's been no evidence put forward that suggests Joe Biden didn't win, and so at some point you got to put up the evidence. And it's pretty clear when President Trump said even before the election that it was going to be fraudulent if he didn't win, and then on the day of the election said that there had been irregularities and that he had really won, when of course he had no such information. The FBI didn't give it to him. Justice Department didn't give it to him. States didn't tell him that. He was hearing just the opposite. And he's continued to speak about it since. So I recognize that members of my party are listening to sources that continue to tell them that he won the election, and perhaps it's sort of a badge of honor to say, yeah, I believe that. But frankly, I think democracy requires people to hear the truth and ultimately to support the truth. Look, more important than who wins an election is that we have elections and that we have democracy. And right now in the world, authoritarian regimes are on the march, are gaining ground. Democracy is retreating. And it is simply unacceptable for the leader of the free world to be casting doubt on the reliability of elections and democracy itself. So it's important for me and for other members of my party and for people of good faith in all parties to come forward and tell the truth and then move on. And by the way, if we want to see a Republican in the White House again, go to work to get someone elected. But spreading untruth about the last election doesn't help anybody.
So a last question, and we're running out of time, but I want to make sure that I put this to you. A year after the January 6th attack on the Capitol, you said the following: "We ignore the lessons of January 6th at our own peril. Democracy is fragile. It cannot survive without leaders of integrity and character who care more about the strength of our republic than about winning the next election." So I want to ask you, you've spent much of your life in public service, for a quick summary of what you think it's going to take to fix what in so many ways is a broken political system.
Well, I wish I had a quick answer to that, David, and I don't. I have a chart on the wall in my office that looks at the history of the Earth going back 2000 BC until now, and looking at the coming and going of various great civilizations. And there have been many that have come and gone. There are a couple of striking things. One, how many were great and then ceased being great. And the other is that virtually all of them were led by autocrats. Autocratic rule is the, if you will, the default setting of world history. And so this democratic republic as a principle is something which is unusual and is fragile. And I think, we grew up with it and think it's got to be this way forever. Actually, looking at the history of the world, it doesn't have to be this way forever. And so I really look to leaders here in Washington and in homes and churches and schools and everywhere to say, look, disagree with one another, but recognize nonetheless in these disagreements that we respect one another, that we respect the Constitution upon which America was founded. The principles of America are right for us and right for people around the world if they want to enjoy prosperity and happiness. And, as you look at, again, at the world history, nations that began to slide, there have been a couple of cases where they've been able to turn around. And they turned around in part because of either some crisis that shook them to their roots, or because of a leader that stood up and was able to pull them together. Whether it was Lincoln or Churchill or even the four great emperors in Rome, there have been people who've come forward at a critical time. And I look to our presidents, Republican and Democrat, to bring us together and hope they will be successful in helping do that.
Senator Mitt Romney, thank you so much for joining us on Washington Post Live. It's really great to have you. We hope you'll come back and talk to us again.
Thanks, David. All the best to you.
So please consult our list of great speakers coming up. go to WashingtonPostLive.com to register for our programming ahead. Thank you especially for joining our conversation today with Senator Mitt Romney.